Hello, welcome Leslie. I am Nadia Colburn, and this is the Align Your Story interview series where I talk to writers, change makers, activists about coming into more aligned stories, both individually and collectively. So today I am with Leslie Salmon Jones, who is a co-founder with her husband, Jeff Jones, of Afro Yoga. This is an embodied practice integrating joyful dance movements of the African diaspora with meditative yoga and live music, promoting individual and collective healing in a compassionate, non-judgmental, inclusive, and safe environment. And since 2008, they've been committed to healing legacies of trauma and have impacted communities worldwide. They offer in-person and virtual classes. You can find out more about them at the link that will be below, and work with people of all ages and abilities, but also have a deep commitment to the heritage, empowerment, education, healing, spirituality, and wellness of the BIPOC communities, and offer Afro yoga as well at low cost or no cost to marginalized communities. So you can hear more about that at their website. They're amazing opportunities, and I encourage everyone to check it out. So Leslie, thank you for joining us today. I always like to ask a first question about your childhood, so we get a little bit of grounding. So what in your childhood do you think prepared you for doing the work that you do today?
First of all, Nadia, thank you for inviting me to be here to speak to you and your audience. So I grew up in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada, and my family, I have three grandparents. I have three grandparents who were Jamaican descent, and one grandparent who was Scottish, Irish, Canadian, my grandmother, and she was the only grandparent I knew. So I started off, my family is extremely multicultural. I grew up in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. I went to Hebrew school with my friends. I went to Black Heritage. I also attended our Anglican church. And I have cousins who are blonde, blue eyes, and from the darkest complexions to the lightest complexions, the whole range. I also have some cousins who were adopted into the family, Indigenous. My dear cousin, who I work very closely with now, Sheila, was adopted, part of the 60s sweep in Canada. I'll explain more about that. Another cousin who was from the Philippines. So complete multicultural, racial family growing up, and also spiritual practices were very different as well.
And were you always someone who loved to dance and move?
Yeah, so fortunately, my aunt, my mother's sister, was a ballet teacher, and she had a ballet studio. So at the age of 7, I was introduced to ballet, and I have been dancing ever since. Also, I had mentioned Black Heritage, which was a place that my parents co-founded with other Caribbean families to give us a place to learn about the African diaspora, because there was really little history, Black history in school. So there I learned Afro-Caribbean dance, West African dance. And so the two worlds met, the European and the African Caribbean ancestry through dance. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. And it's so interesting how different cultures have really different ways of moving. I was also trained took ballet classes and kind of was somewhat serious about ballet when I was growing up. And then I started to do modern dance. It was like a whole different way of moving my body. And then taking some African dance classes, like, well, here's a whole different way. So do you think that dancing in those different traditions gave you kind of a visceral sense in a different way from all the other things that you were doing of these different cultures that you were part of and interacting with and learning from?
That's a really good question. It's interesting because it's complicated, as we know, like there's intersectionality. It can really crunch us, like all of the different paths and journeys and sensations in my body, and having like the oppressed and the oppressor, and not being able to articulate that at the time, but now I can. So when I was taking ballet, my body type was not the typical ballerina, thin white body. And fortunately, because it was my aunt, I didn't have that kind of pressure. It wasn't until later when I went to Albanelli that, or even outside, I went to New York when I was a teenager to the Joffrey Ballet. I trained there. I really was really aware of my body type and being muscular and strong. And so, and also I was an athlete. I was a runner. I was a sprinter. So I actually quit dance because of my body type and my insecurities around that, and not feeling like I fit in and into this art form, this expression. And then meantime, in African dance and Afro-Caribbean dance, there was a freedom to it. There was just like such a joy. And it wasn't about body type. It was about community, which is a whole different orientation. It's a non-judgmental environment where everyone's welcome. You can have all kinds of people from all kinds of different cultures, and you will be welcome. So that was a whole different orientation. And I think I had to do a lot of healing because of my dance, because of the insecurities and the body shaming that I had because of dance. At the same time, dance was a way to free myself.
Right.
So, yeah.
I think that's actually true for many people working in lots of different art forms. And I work a lot with writers, and there's such a hierarchical tradition of writers that often we can feel like, wait, where does my voice fit in? I haven't seen a voice like that before. And then to realize my voice is my voice. I can speak in my voice, but it's a kind of like some of that education, that the classical education, and I've seen you move, you still have that background that you're carrying in your body, but you also have that freedom. So to navigate those different schools of teaching and thought and access to our own body and voice and self is a journey, I think, for many of us in different genres.
Yeah, definitely. And then also, like, the other layer is that there wasn't a lot of Black images when I was growing up. So it wasn't until I saw Albanelli when I was 13, and I was like, oh my gosh, look at these beautiful Black bodies like flying across the stage with such power and grace. And so it wasn't until sometimes you see yourself, particularly as a young person, that, oh, wow, that could be me actually up there on the stage. So that was another layer to it. And then the other layer was that growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood area, and having a relationship to my body, because oftentimes, like, there were some, there were not everyone, there were a few enough racists to call me the N-word or something like that, which makes you contract. There was a contraction that happens, and then you think, oh, my hair's not straight, or this and that. So that was the other layer also, when you don't see yourself in a society reflected. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that, the importance of community, of forging new communities, of creating a different vision of what community can be. But first I want to ask you, so where did yoga come in to this whole mix?
Yeah, so when I went to train at Albanelli, so I had quit dance for quite some time. And then I went through an identity crisis, really, when I was around college age. I was just trying to figure it out, as many of us are. And but I did go through actually a spiritual crisis awakening, which is a whole other story. But basically, I lost, how I could describe it is I lost my light. I couldn't quite find my light. And so I went down. I felt like I was going down a very slippery slope very quickly, in a sense. And it was really the best thing that happened to me because I had to fight for my life. So I was like, felt like spiritually, I was holding on to my life by my fingernails. And in that moment, it was that I actually consulted with my aunt. Her name was Savella Conception. She was a clairvoyant. She was an astrologist and clairvoyant. And I knew I was in a spiritual crisis that I couldn't really go to anyone else. And she actually helped me. And she helped me create positive mantra and also refine myself again through going through a series of rituals, cleansing rituals, and to get clarity. And I started listening to my heart. And the thing that really, really helped me guide me back into dance was I just wanted to refine my passion, and dance was the thing that brought me joy. So I was like, I'm going to go back into dance. So I did, and I went to Albanelli. And so at Albanelli, this is 91, yoga was a requirement. Required to practice yoga. So yoga and dance for me have always been like that intersection has always been there. And then through my healing journey. And Albanelli, if some of you don't know Albanelli, I definitely recommend you to look him up for those who are listening. But he was an African-American choreographer who was so amazing and really had an impact on American culture, Black culture, and culture period all over the world. But he was also a yogi. He knew the power of yoga and healing. So I was so grateful for that.
I didn't know that about him. That's very cool. I was so lucky I got to see Albanelli this winter in New York. So good. Just, anyone hasn't seen their dances, especially Revelations. You have to start one place, start with that dance. But that's so interesting that he was a yogi, and that spiritual quest, that kind of awakening, that finding your light, going into your heart, that there's the outward move to our art, but then there's also the inner move, and yoga can help us, right? It's like my understanding is the meaning of the word yoga is that connection, that yoking together, that yoking of the inner and outer. So one thing I wanted to ask you about is, I will have lots of things I want to ask you about, but I know that you now, well, can you tell us a little bit about then in Afro Flow Yoga, you're bringing together the traditions of yoga and African dance and creating for people experiences to, I'm gonna, excuse me for talking for Afro Flow Yoga. What are you doing? So I'm not saying, but to kind of enter their bodies, heal, connect. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing. And I think that for everyone, you have online classes so people can connect to your classes online, but also one thing that I talk to people a lot about is that our stories are stored in our body and that we access them through our body. So even if we're not dancers, we can have tools to dance, to do yoga, to reconnect with ourselves, not only our individual stories, but also our intergenerational and cultural stories. And that's really, I think, what you're doing. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be amazing.
Sure. Well, I always like to start at the roots. So in West Africa, there is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the symbol, the Sankofa. I had it, I'd show it to you, but it's like, it's shown in two ways. One is a bird and it's reaching back to its tail. And it's like getting that deep history. And the other way it's shown is like it's like a heart going inward. So it's returning back to the heart. So, so Jeff and I, my husband and I, we've been married 25 years. This will be our 26th year. After 3 of our parents passed away, we had been married for about 10 years. And within that 10-year span, 3 of our parents passed away. Now, Jeff is African-American, 4th generation here in Boston. In fact, I'm sitting in the house that's been in his family for 108 years.
Oh, cool.
And in fact, the bass is, all of these instruments are Jeff's, but his father used to play with Billie Holiday, Sammy Davis Jr., the bass back there. And And so history is really important to us. And because he's American, African American, the US kept inventory. So all of the people who had been enslaved were considered inventory. And so they were able to trace back to like an 8-year-old enslaved African girl who came in through Wilmington, North Carolina. And his family tree is like huge. And it's really amazing how they've been able to maintain the roots. Me, on the other hand, are in my European ancestry, we can trace back to Scotland, Dundee, Scotland, and Ireland. We have a book this thick, and it's like all the names, and it's well preserved. The Jamaican side was, in the islands, it wasn't that, it was more the oral tradition. So you'd lose a lot of things that way. So we went to West Africa in 2007. We went to Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, and Benin to actually return, like the Sankofa, and to go into the slave dungeons, which I highly recommend people, do, because it's an important history. And there we learned, number one, we were answering the prayers of our ancestors to return back to the land where they were taken. And number two, we learned about the methodologies of slavery and what it took, how people had PhDs to learn how to dehumanize people to be able to enslave very strong, powerful people. So that was our journey. And through that, after we got back, I'm a very empathetic person. So standing in the female slave dungeons really, really shifted me in many ways. So I actually ended up doing a lot of deep healing in my room for 2 years, and also traveling and doing work with shaman healers, a shaman healer from Zimbabwe named Mandaza, a healer from Burkina Faso who just passed away, Patrice Melodomo Somé, look him up. Amazing. He passed in December. He's now an ancestor. And another one of my spiritual mentors, her name's Maud, and she's from Haiti. So I traveled with them. I did ritual, Jeff did ritual. And that ritual was really to learn to connect to our ancestors. And so we did rituals for our ancestors, and they're constantly guiding us. We're constantly tapping in. So with Afro Flow Yoga, it was from that root that informed that actually Afro Flow Yoga was birthed. It came through a vision, meditation, prayer, and it was actually in manifestation in September 2008 when I was invited to teach in Sedona at the Raw Spirit Festival. And the ancestors, God, spirit, whatever you want to call it, gave me the guideline. This is what it's going to be. This is how it's going to be. And then Jeff was like, we need live music and all the things. So I know that's long-winded, but that's kind of the beginning of Afro Flow Yoga through our own healing.
That's really beautiful. And I just want to comment on it, that for many people in the beginning, the path of healing can feel like it's taking us out of the world, that it's taking us inward. This is something that I say many times, but I just see it in the journeys again and again, that it can feel like a shutting down, or I don't have time for this. But if you follow that path, your story is such a beautiful example of what grows as a result of trusting that path of healing, that it doesn't disconnect you from the world. It connects you more. It creates community. There's a creative energy within that healing, even if at first it doesn't feel like it.
That's right. That's right. It brings us closer to ourselves, closer to our essence, closer to the gifts, the fruits that we bear.
And closer to, in your story, those ancestors, those healers that you're talking to, it gets out of the individual self into a larger collective that you're listening to. It's a matter of listening. So I always tell my students, it's about listening, tapping into that listening, which it sounds like your story is just all about.
That's right. That's right. So we continued the work through, we think about our ancestors, we think about their liberation. We think about how they made sacrifices for our liberation. And so we want to continue that work for the liberation of future generations.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And um, often we think of, I mean, I talk a lot about like deep listening, and you just talked about listening. When you are kind of the ancestors are communicating to you, however they are, do you hear it as listening? Do you hear it through your body? Where is that coming through?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes it can come through a whisper, like it just comes into my head, like very clear, like Afro flow yoga. It came, like I heard it. I actually heard it. And sometimes, like as Afro flow yoga was being formed, initially I would teach it like a regular yoga class in the grid system, like people are in line, and then it was like, no, that doesn't work. Got to do it in a circle. So sometimes it even comes through the embodied practice.
Mhm.
It just comes like in the moment. It's like everyone get in a circle,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. And so when Jeff and I are in the flow, in the practice, we don't talk about what we're going to do. We prepare ourselves to get out of the way to allow the stream of consciousness to come through. And
Yeah.
we're listening, constantly listening, because, and within that, things happen that are beyond us.
Right.
And when people come to the circle, they're also coming. We prepare them to also get out of the way so that whatever comes through can really come through. And that's where the real healing is.
Right.
It's when we allow and we listen and we get out of the way and allow that energy to come through.
Yeah. And that flow right there in your name.
Yeah.
So in your story, you were there, you were standing in these dungeons where slaves were children, women, and it sounds like you had a real physical response to that, brought up a lot of pain. So
Yeah.
often when people think about going back and doing this healing, there's so much pain. There's so much intergenerational pain for African Americans, and then for people really I don't think there's anyone whose family hasn't experienced a lot of pain. Um, what allowed you to, or what do you recommend to people to hold that pain and not feel like they're being submerged by it?
Yeah. So one thing I want to say is that we say enslaved as opposed to slaves.
Yes,
Yeah.
apology.
Yeah. No, that's okay. That's okay. And that is a distinction that I had to teach myself as well.
And this is just an example of, thank you for that. I actually didn't
You
know
know,
that, but
I,
it's an old history of speaking. Just language is it's embedded in us, right? That's the language I spoke as a little girl, and I haven't quite caught up. So
yeah.
thank you for that education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's and I often say, like, I've been colonized, you've been colonized. This is and we have colonized conditioning and
Sure.
mind, and within that is a language that is of the colonizer. So
Right.
I'm working on myself to change the language and be aware of the language. So thank you for, I know I'm aware that I'm not surprised because
But,
so
I think actually this exchange is so important. It's about language too, right? Language really matters, and it can be a friendly exchange to say, "Hey, remember?"
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and reminding each other. So
Yeah.
if that happens for me, I'm inviting you to remind me. So back to the question of pain and being in the body and being historical, something that we might inherit. And I think that so helpful to have the practices, the tools of pranayama, of the breath, of being able to sit and be mindful of the thoughts that come up, be mindful of the words that we speak, and also coming into a compassionate place for ourselves. Because I think that has been, that was a real tough nut to crack for my own healing journey, was like, there's so many layers to it. Like looking at the limitations of the harmful thoughts in my mind. Like I had to really take them piece by piece. I had to go through, like, how am I limiting myself? What am I saying that it's harmful? Can I actually change those mantras? Can I change those thoughts? And so like that was a whole thing. The emotional piece. It's like looking at, where are those? Is that something that I inherited from someone else? Is it part of my own? What about the stories that I created? Are those stories or perceptions? So can I reframe them? And then the physical, like actually having in the body, like the pain in the back, the pain in the neck, those things, and listening, and again, going in with a compassionate, navigating with being very loving. So I think finding that piece of like, I can maybe do it for other people, but can I actually do it for myself? Can I actually hold that space for myself and say, it's okay, Leslie, it's okay. Nothing's perfect. And I think one of the moments I realized that when Jeff and I started dating, actually, and I remember we were locking eyes, and I was just having one of those moments where, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not all the things, right? And I was saying it out loud, in looking in his eyes, and he said, don't you ever talk about yourself like that again. Like, he had my back when I didn't have my back.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something about that, like that witnessing, but doing it in a way that that helped me really stop that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're often most harsh to ourselves. And then having that permission not to be in pain,
Yeah.
which that sometimes needs a lot of unraveling, because my ancestors were in pain.
Right.
So who am I not to carry it forward and to reframe that story to say, as you did, like, I'm going back for my ancestors. I'm healing for my ancestors and for future generations. They've carried me so that I could be here, so that I can do this work of healing. Because I think so many people have a kind of natural survivor's guilt, right? So to really actively understand that it's okay to change the story, because we get stuck in the old story. We think, they live that, I need to live it too. It's easy to say, but hard to do, right? Especially within ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's why mindfulness practices are so helpful. Breath work, yoga practices, all of those things are so helpful, having the tools, because no one's exempt from the pain. No one's exempt from the trauma. It's how we deal with it and having the tools. So I feel really grateful that I developed those tools from a young age, to be able to put them to test. Like, my brother passed away last summer. And it was very sudden. We had no idea. And Jeff and I, when we heard the news, we were actually meditating back to back. And there was something about that moment of how we received that information that really helped me, through the grieving process. It was like I was sitting in stillness when I heard. So, I feel really grateful for that. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Those practices have totally changed my life. And I feel so lucky, as I think you do too, to be able to share them with other people, to like make that be part of what changes the story. What about for people who have a different background, who aren't, part of the African diaspora? Is there a way for them to access your teachings? And, what do you recommend for people who feel also there can be a lot of pain, not only in having enslaved people as ancestors, but also having people on the other side, whether you have slaveholders in your family or just being part of the society, what do you recommend that people do to hold that kind of pain as well?
Yeah.
Or
So I
guilt, or
yeah, yeah. So I have that all in my body. I have the enslaved. I have, the European side who enslaved my African ancestors. My European ancestors who enslaved. I have the white man, and I have the African, the Black woman. I have it all in my body. And so for me, it was thinking about like allowing those feelings to come up. So there was one point where I was like, how do I heal all these parts in me? And healing really to reconcile, because am I mad at myself? Am I, like, how do you do that? So sitting with it, and first being aware of the stories, aware of the history, and aware of all of it, and then noticing what comes up. So we work with a friend of ours, her name's Katrina Brown, and her family, she discovered they were the largest slave traders in America. And so we've done racial healing work with her over the last decade. And basically, her work, she deals with the guilt, the shame, the fear, and all of the things that come up. And so when I think of, like, if you think of the American story, like, this is all of our history. It's not just Black history. Like, I know we have Black history, it's not just Black history, it's everyone's history. So how do we actually, it's not ours, that we didn't create it, but we have inherited it, and we actually live with it. We are living these things out. So knowing the history, feeling the sensations that come up, bringing awareness to them, and then, reconciling, being able to release, being able to really be with it. Like you said, going into the pain, because the pain is actually there. It's a signal. It's like, ooh, something's not quite right here. Our tendency is to go out of it and get away from it because it's too painful. But when we do that, it becomes louder and louder and louder, and it can manifest in all kinds of ways in the body and in our lives. So when we do go into it, and with our friends, the breath, mindfulness, all those tools, then we can actually dissipate it and relieve ourselves of it. And when we do that, we're actually healing legacies of trauma. We're recreating a new story, a new pattern, and then for generations to come, we don't have to pass it along.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Yeah, I think all of us have we have so many different ancestors, and we've inherited so many different things. It's part of our individual history, it's part of our collective history, around race, around gender, around pretty much everything. So I also want to ask you just a little bit about the concern some people have about cultural appropriation. I think it's maybe related to the kind of intersectionality that we've been talking about a little bit, but how do you kind of respond to questions of working with different cultures respectfully, and also, celebrating that we can learn from these different cultures?
Yeah, so I think about that a lot, actually. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, I was thinking about this notion of, let's just take in, and I keep going to black and white, and like sort of I'm taking the microcosm of the American culture, actually all throughout. I'm using the enslavement process and journey as an example, because there's so many things that are happening in Ukraine now. There's so many things that are happening, right? So I've been thinking of the notion of black and white, for example, race. You're being asked to choose a race. Are you black? Are you white? And there's a whole history to that, where it's a social construct. The superiority, people back in like hundreds of years ago, they were, I think it was a French, there's a whole history to it. But basically, it was designed for economic gain, right? So if you take people and it's like, okay, let's pit them against each other. We're going to have white people, we're going to say they're superior, and black people, we're going to call them black people, people of African descent, they're inferior. So there are so many people, like in my family, coming from different intersections. If you look at me, you wouldn't probably imagine that most of my family members are white, like my cousins on my mom's side, because my mom's mixed race and she was the only one who married my dad, who's like Jamaican descent. Everybody else married European descent. So most of my first cousins are white appearing, but they're not.
Right.
Appearing. So there's an assimilation process that happens. For example, when whether it's Jewish people or Italian folks, or people come into this country or into North America or wherever they are, there was a question like, check the box. Are you white? Are you black? Let me look at my skin. Oh, it looks white. I'm white. But that may not necessarily be the truth. Like my first cousins, they're not. So it creates this illusion of separation, number one. And then you have culture. So technically, like I was saying, by race, I'm not black. By race, by color, I'm brown. By culture, I identify with Black culture. So there's a differentiation between the race and the culture. And with Black culture comes all of the things, the good, bad, ugly, and wonderful with the culture. And same thing maybe with white culture. And what does that mean, white culture? Does that mean you actually believe you're superior? Does that mean so you know what I mean? So there's all of these things. So what happens is that with cultural appropriation, it's like, ooh, I like that fruit. That fruit is sweet. I'm just going to pick from that tree just the fruit, and I'm going to eat the fruit. And then I'm going to sell the fruit, right? From the tree, but I'm not going into the root. I'm just going for the fruit.
Yeah.
So it's going for the fruit without the root is what I believe is the cultural appropriation.
That's beautifully said. And that we are all connected to those roots, and that it's all complicated, right? Because it's going down into the soil. And yet we're also so lucky. I just feel so lucky to be living now where we do have these teachings. I wouldn't have had access to mindfulness and breath work, a few generations. Well, I guess, Emerson did, but I wasn't Emerson. So, some who knows where my family was living anyway, in Eastern Europe in a ghetto. But so it's this funny time we live in, where we have so many teachings, but we have to remember not to forget our roots. And I think that's true for us individually too, that our healing takes us back to our roots, that we can't that's not comfortable. I want to move away from it. That healing comes from going deep and looking at the roots.
Right, that's right. And in our case in Afro Flow Yoga, what's wonderful is part of the dehumanization process was to cut the tree from its roots. That's how you dehumanize people. You cut them from their root, from their spiritual practices, from their families, from their homes, from all of that. And that's when people will snap, like they're basically, right? So, so knowing that and really learning about that throughout our ancestral journey, the beauty has been to really investigate those roots and to find out that yoga has been in Africa for thousands of years, hieroglyphics in Egypt, and to find out that meditation and the tree of life and all of these things already been there. All these practices have already been there. They just have not been carried forth because they'd strengthened people. So there's like such a through the Dravidian, like the culture in the East, they in India and Africa shared so much wealth and so much wisdom. And so a lot of that's not spoken about because they don't want people to when I say they, I'd say that people who had power, economic power, didn't want people getting together because then it would mean the potential of losing that economic power.
Right. I love that. That brings us back to the community that you talked about in the beginning, about reframing the story so that the story isn't just the individual story, but it's connecting with the roots. And I love also that the roots is a metaphor that takes us into the earth. We're connected to the earth. We're all connected.
That's right.
And that we find community, and we have that strength. And so that as we're tapping into it's through our individual bodies, but holding something bigger and finding our way forward into a future we want to imagine.
Exactly. It's all part of the tree of life. We're all part of it. And then when the fruit falls, it goes back down at the roots and we come back up. It's that beautiful cycle.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I always is there anything else you want to just add or share before we go to the final three kind of questions I like to ask?
I always love to, because we're talking about the roots, I always love to bring in my parents and Jeff's parents because they're always with us and they're a huge part of the story. And I would just say that I pay homage to our parents because really they shaped, like, for example, my mom, she's still with us. Her name's Beverly Salmon. And she fuels me daily. She's my inspiration. She was a nurse and she's mixed race, yet she could pass for white. And my mother chose not to, which was so courageous. She is such a courageous woman. And she really stood, and even that it wasn't visible that she's a woman of color, she stood as a woman of color. And so she became a nurse, and then she went into grassroots. She became a politician, human rights activist, women's rights activist. And now she's just like this amazing, she's just done a lot of great work in Canada. So I pay homage to her. And my dad also, who had been orphaned and born in Toronto as well, of my Jamaican grandparents. And he was an orphan at age 3 and 5. And then he became a doctor and he was a musician. And he became Canada's first Black surgeon trained through the university and also chief of surgery. And it was a pioneer in gastric bypass for the morbidly obese. So I worked with both of them when I was growing up in their offices. And so they really planted the seeds of my mom being an agent of change and my dad showing me how important our well-being is and the healing of that. And then my husband, Jeff, who's an amazing engineer and musician. I pay homage to him every day because he's just an amazing soul. And then his father also being a musician and an activist, and his mother being a cultural soprano, really infuses in him his gifts and continuing his gifts. And lastly, we actually found out pretty recently over the last few years that our families have been connected. We met on a plane in '94, and they've been connected through the civil rights movement. Jeff's cousin was Betty Shabazz, Malcolm X's wife. And my mom's first cousin was one of Betty Shabazz's best friends. So we just found that out a few years ago. So we're continuing the work. That just speaks to like the threads and the flow, and we all have that. And I just encourage that investigation, like keep going inward and investigate, because we all have those threads. I'm sure, Nadia, you and I can talk for like another 2 hours and find out we have some kind of connection at the
Yeah,
root, right?
totally. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love that that actually helps answer the question of how did you get to do what you do today? It's going back to the roots. Here we are. And, for some people, there's, struggle with our parents, in my case. But that's also makes me who I am, and I can see, as you said, everything has been a blessing in its own way, that we've learned lessons and we carry some of the pain and we let go of some of the pain and the gifts and the journey. So yeah, that's just beautiful. And I was so lucky to get to meet your mom.
Oh, yes, that's right.
That
Oh
was
my
really
God.
fun. Yeah,
Right.
I felt really lucky. I could tell in the little bit of time I got to spend with her. She's really an amazing woman. So my final three questions I always like to ask, in the spirit of sharing appreciations, and inspiring others to share appreciations. What's something that you've been enjoying recently? It could be a piece of music, it could be a dance you've gone to, a book.
Oh, goodness. There is so many things, but I would, I mean, my husband, I've been listening to a lot of going out to some jazz. I love appreciating local musicians. With the pandemic, it's been so hard
I know.
to hear good live music. And
So I have to interrupt you. Are there places in Boston you like to go?
yeah, so we were at Sculler's Jazz Club, which is right around the corner from our house, just 2 days ago, and we went a couple of times, and it was just, there was something so magical about it, because what I loved about it was that the musicians got a chance to, you could just feel like it, like people are really in it. But then, because we have Berklee College of Music, there were so many students who came out, and because they are graduating, like some are graduating now, but they spent most of their time in the pandemic where they couldn't go out, they were so grateful for everything. They were just like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever, and they were so excited to meet the musicians and so excited to talk to people. So that aliveness, like the music is such amazing medicine.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And that's reminding me, I want to go there.
Yes,
um,
yes. We
super
can go
fun.
one day. We can go one day.
Yeah, awesome. And then is there a practice that you do? I know you do many practices, but something that you can maybe share with people who are listening, like a regular, just on the simpler side, centering or grounding or lifting, uplifting practice?
The thing that I do, and I feel like I've done this for years, but now it's just automatic, like brushing my teeth, is the simplest thing of gratitude. And I add to it because I'd say, like when I wake up in the morning, I'll do my gratitudes. But I did hear about Buddhist monks, their practices when they get up, before they even get out of bed. They focus on death, actually, but in a way that they're grateful for their breath, like I am alive today. And
Mhm.
so I've been incorporating that, and just before I do anything, just grateful for my breath. And then I go through, grateful for Jeff, grateful for this, and I just go through the list and it expands, and it always makes me feel so good. By the time I get out of bed, I am on the right side of the track. I just feel um, so grateful, even in the times, even when my brother passed, even when like times when things are so challenging, there's still glimpses of like gratitude. And I find that particularly when things are so hard, that is what I hold on to. And that
Yeah.
gets real.
Yeah, it's great to remind one another of these practices. Thank you for sharing that. And then my final question is there an activity that you engage in sometimes aside from your work, which is clearly very engaged in the larger world, but that takes you out of your kind of local spheres and in some ways is working towards larger structural change, not on an individual basis, but
Yeah.
just in some other arena.
Yeah, well, this is probably very connected, but it's still in I'm on the board of the Yoga Alliance, so that's still kind of in
Yeah,
my, isn't it?
no, that's good because it's a whole big organization kind of shifting cultural. Yeah, talk about it. That would be great.
Yes, yes. So it's my fourth year of being on the board of the Yoga Alliance. And so if some of you aren't familiar with the Yoga Alliance, it's like the largest yoga registry in the world. And basically, when people get certified, many people, not all, go through the Yoga Alliance, and yoga studios, they go through the Yoga Alliance to become, sort of like the stamp of the Yoga Alliance. So I was invited to join the board 4 years ago. And the reason I was invited to join the board is because Jeff and I are often the only presenters of color, some of the few, but really often only, and that's problematic. And so I'm very vocal about that. I do not shy away from that. And so I had been working with other retreat centers and organizations that we go into, or corporations, and I'm not doing it from a place of anger, but I'm doing it from a place of like, we could do better. Like, let's do better. And there's so many people who coming from underserved communities, and there's nothing wrong with the people. It's just the systems that need the healing. So how do we open the door? So so this is one of the things when I joined the Yoga Alliance. They had a new mission and vision to be more inclusive and diverse and equitable. So that's the work right now I'm doing. And I know that work is going to have a huge impact, because the yoga industry, which is no longer a community, it's an industry, it's $1 billion industry, and it has such an impact on communities all over the world. So I'm very committed to shifting that.
Thank you for doing that work. And it's a good reminder that there are so many different ways people can do activism work, starting from, our roots, what we are already engaged in, and, what we love. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much for sharing your time. It's such a pleasure talking to you. And I'll put links to Afro Flow Yoga in the text documentation.
Thank you, Nadia. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you and your amazing community.